Before I get into the introduction, I want to point out that for these Igavania games, researching all relevant information online is a nightmare. My search took me from the Castlevania and Bloodstained wikis to GameFAQs, from strategy posts and forums to YouTube playthroughs, and I still think I missed some pertinent details. So I've created a Google Doc to document as much gameplay information as I can about each bonus playable character of each version of each Igavania game that I've covered so far. However, when I've missed something or said something incorrect, please post a reply to my pinned comment so I can add that info to my comment and update the Google Doc. I think having all this information in one place helps to future-proof some of these game modes. Way back in Season 0 times, I released a video about bonus playable characters, which I still think is an interesting topic. These are playable characters included as a reward, usually for beating a game or meeting some other requirement. An extra mode to give players a novel experience going through the game again. While they usually don't get much coverage, these bonus characters can introduce some very unique playstyles to a game, which is why I find them so fascinating. However, that old rushed video has aged like milk. Especially my thoughts on Symphony of the Night. I won't defend those comments or the brief segment I gave the game, but I will explain. At that time, I'd only played Symphony once, on the PS3, with a wireless controller, and that was while house sitting and watching the owner's dogs. And I was on a time crunch, so it was not an optimal gaming setup. And as far as the music goes, I may have had the volume low so I could listen for the dogs, I don't know. After spending a little time with the OST, it has some absolute bangers, which you'll probably hear in this video. At the time, all these factors really soured my opinion of the game, hence my comments in that video. About a year later, I replayed the game on a PlayStation emulator with a wired PS2 controller and headphones, and I had a great time. That's why I've decided to revive the bonus playable characters concept and revisit the series, to take another go at Symphony and really give each game its time to shine. This will be part 1 of the Igavania games, meaning Metroidvania action RPGs where Koji Igarashi was pretty heavily involved, and we'll cover all 3 major versions of Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. That's right, kind of the bookends of the Igavania games. Sometime down the line, part 2 will cover the GBA trilogy and part 3 will cover the DS trilogy. And I've never played the Lords of Shadow games, but if Mirror of Fate is a Metroidvania, it could get its own addendum someday. Without further ado, let's start with Symphony of the Night. A sequel to the TurboGrafx-16 game Rondo of Blood, each version of Symphony begins with a recreation of Rondo's final stage, where you play as Richter Belmont defeating Dracula in his throne room. 4 years later, Castlevania returns and Alucard awakens from his slumber to head to the castle and destroy it. This game completes the Vania portion of the Metroidvania moniker. It combines the exploration that so many loved from Super Metroid, which looked conveniently similar to the structure of Castlevania 2, with action RPG gameplay including leveling up and finding items and better equipment. This combination is really what cemented the Metroidvania as a genre, now with countless games following the formula, and perpetuated the Castlevania series about a decade longer before it really started fizzling out. Let me take a stab at a more accurate, updated overview of my thoughts on the game itself. My least favorite part of the game is the beginning. After Death steals his equipment, Alucard feels pretty fragile, especially if you're getting reacquainted with controls. But then it grows on me during the mid-game, where you're exploring the castle to find new abilities and stronger gear, and gain levels. The tables seem to turn and Alucard starts to feel almost too strong at times as you explore the most secluded corners of the castle and unlock the path to the center room. And I also like the endgame in the inverted castle. It presents more of a challenge as the monsters here are a lot stronger, so exploring becomes a game of how far can you go until you need to head back to a save room. My main criticism has to be the excessive knockback from enemies and their attacks. It can make some rooms a chore, and I think taking giant chunks from Alucard's health is penalty enough. And knockback doesn't lessen when you're massively overpowered compared to your foes. That, and maybe 1 or 2 more teleport rooms would have eased navigation a bit. Ultimately, the power creep of the RPG mechanics, alongside the myriad combat options and hours of exploration, make for a solid game. Symphony of the Night actually has 3 major versions with various headache-inducing degrees of overlap. Jumping into the bonus playable characters, or BPCs, will take them by the different versions of the game. But just know that none of these characters gain experience or collect pickups, but I believe they get a power boost upon entering the inverted castle. Life vessels increase their max HP, but heart vessels only restore 30 hearts. And they all have access to every one of their abilities from the start. Like I said earlier, I'll try to be comprehensive here, but let me know if I got anything wrong or missed something. The PlayStation version serves as the baseline for all others, and I believe this is the version they released on the 360 and PS3, which is how I originally played it. That being said, the only BPC here is Richter, unlocked by defeating Dracula. He plays the same as he does in the introduction, so you can try out all these abilities there. His default attack is to whip the vampire killer. He can also brandish his whip, useful for small enemies and deflecting projectiles, and breaking tradition, its damage output is actually the same as a regular attack. Richter is able to run with a double tap in the desired direction. And though he lacks a double jump, he has this backflip move, but it seems to be most useful for speedrunners chaining other abilities together. His high jump is more of an attack, effective against small targets above him and can easily be chained together. I was surprised when revisiting Symphony that Alucard couldn't slide, but Richter certainly can, traveling quite fast and dealing damage as he goes, and he can end it with a slide jump. His Blade Dash is an ability where Richter dashes, enveloped by his spinning whip, granting him invincibility and dealing damage, which is very cool and also useful, but I always struggle with the fighting game styled input. Finally, Richter can use all the same sub-weapons as Alucard, but he can also activate their item crashes. An item crash is a giant, powerful attack at the cost of more hearts. From what I've read and experienced, the axes, knives, and holy water have the best crashes. Without healing options besides save rooms, Richter can't take many hits like a souped-up, decked-out Alucard can. Find as many life vessels as you can so he doesn't die so fast. He is powerful, and can be quite speedy if you know what you're doing. I've seen posts describing him as a glass cannon, and I think that's apropos. With his familiar yet distinct abilities and his early access to any place in the castle, Richter was a solid first Metroidvania bonus playable character. Released only in Japan a year later, the SotN version includes a number of minor new additions like new enemies, bosses including Maria, and items including the Godspeed Shoes relic allowing Alucard to run like Richter. The more substantial additions are the two new areas, the Cursed Prison and the Underground Garden, each with their own new theme, alongside one of the BPCs we'll look at soon. But with its longer and more frequent loading and lower graphical fidelity, this version was infamously described by Igarashi himself as a disappointment. Although I'd say it's a perfectly serviceable way to play through Symphony of the Night, especially if you're looking to replay it but want a little variety, or just need something to add to your SotN collection. I played it with a translation patch by King of Dragon, which subs the dialogue with the PlayStation version. This time, Richter mode is available from the start, and he plays exactly like he does in the PlayStation version, as far as I can tell. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. However, by holding up and selecting Richter with C, he dons his jacket so he can play through the game with his new sprite. Besides that, he can go through the new areas and can head to the inverted castle as soon as he can make it through to the castle keep. The new mode here is Maria mode, also available from the start. She's quite mobile with Richter's double tap run, Alucard's backdash, a rolling slide, a double and triple jump, and the high jump. She also has a bunch of offensive options. Her default attack is an energy shot, which functions a lot like Mega Man's Mega Buster as a base projectile. It can be fired downwards and charged up to 4 levels. A little button combo activates the Guardian Knuckle, which is a lightning punch. Her other default attack on the left-hand button is a kick, and then kicking while running activates the drop kick, which is quite powerful. And after a triple jump, she can perform a jump kick, and then jump twice again to chain another one if she wants. She also has a few summons. The owl attacks nearby enemies. The dragon can be flown around to damage enemies. The cat shoots fire. And the turtle heals Maria. She can also summon all 4 at once for invincibility, touch damage, and increased kicking damage. And yes, it's as OP as it sounds, but this button combo can be tricky. If that wasn't enough, she can use all of the sub-weapons, they're just more powerful variants. No item crashes, but honestly she doesn't need them. And her heart max is 999, so she rarely runs out. Maria is probably the most overpowered bonus playable character we'll see in this part, maybe even in the series. Even without summons via the tricky button combos, she can dish out a ton of pain quickly, and I think regardless of your thoughts on the Saturn version, this mode is worth a try. Released as a bonus unlock on the Rondo of Blood 2.5 remake, The Dracula X Chronicles, the PSP version of Symphony is, from what I can tell, based on the PlayStation version, which makes sense based on Igarashi's Saturn comments. To unlock it, you must find a specific item in the 2.5D version of Rondo. The English version was relocalized with the same voice actors as in the Rondo remake, more closely matching the Japanese version.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets! But enough talk! Have at you!
Ha! Mankind! A cesspit of hatred and lies! Fight for them, then, and die for their sins!
Some sound effects were redone as well. And Alucard again fights Maria in the center of the castle, but she has completely different attacks. Richter mode must again be unlocked by defeating Dracula. He only has his PlayStation sprite, but again, as far as I can tell, he plays exactly like he does in the other two versions. The Saturn exclusive Maria mode did not make the transition. Instead, they created a new Maria mode which apparently plays like her Rondo of Blood incarnation. Also unlocked by beating Dracula, Maria here has a brand new set of moves. She doesn't have a weapon equipped, so her default attack is to send out owls which will return to her. She runs by default and is quite fast. She can dash left and right using L and R, and she can slide. In this version she can only double jump, and she can jump kick from there. After her high jump she can glide by holding the jump button. She can also activate her rolling attack with a little button combo, but will take damage unless she kills the enemy. This Maria has a unique set of sub-weapons based on the 4 sacred beasts, and can hold 2 at a time and swap the main and spare slots. Just know that a collected sub-weapon goes into her spare slot. In this version, she can also perform item crashes, which will summon one of her 4 sacred beasts, or the Guardian Knuckle. This Maria mode is nothing like the Saturn one. If Richter is a glass cannon, the PSP Maria is a paper sword. Her damage output is limited by how many hearts she has since her owls do very little, all while just a few hits will send her to the game over screen. Besides her speed, her mobility options aren't too stellar either. Like Richter, finding life vessels is the key to keeping Maria alive long enough to get where you want to go, and make sure to keep that heart count high as well. I'd say this is the most difficult bonus playable character in Symphony of the Night. The PS4 version of Symphony, released in Castlevania Requiem, is actually the same as the PSP one unlocked in the Dracula X Chronicles, so the footage here is all banned from the PS4. That being said, it's a solid product, with 1 or 2 small issues like a consistent brief stutter while saving and weird punctuation problems in the text boxes, and I believe using this version allowed Sony to make the package a PS4 exclusive. I just wish it could have been a complete edition of Symphony of the Night, maybe with a PlayStation version as the default, and in the option menu there'd be toggles for things like the new Saturn areas and items, and the PSP's new dub, and have both versions of Maria available. But that would be a lot of work. What we got here is more than serviceable, and I really like owning a physical copy of the game. I'll finish Symphony off with a quick comparison. I'm a little obsessed with how fast characters can move side to side, so I did a rudimentary running test, and feel free to critique my methodology. Assuming Alucard and Richter's speeds are constant across all versions, here are all the characters' movement abilities ranked from slowest to fastest. First is both Richter and Saturn Maria's default walking speed, followed by Alucard's default walking speed. Next is both Saturn Maria and Alucard's backdash. Then we have Alucard, Richter, and Saturn Maria's run plus PSP Maria's default walking speed. And then we have both Maria's slides, followed by the PSP Maria's dash. Next is Richter's slide, and finally Alucard's wolf form, zooming right past the rest. Whereas Symphony of the Night was the first Igavania game, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is, at the time of recording, the most current Igavania game. Because of Konami's aversion to creating any more Castlevania games, Bloodstained was conceived as a spiritual successor to the Igavanias, Symphony first and foremost. Playing as Miriam is a lot like playing as Alucard, starting off with a very basic moveset and progressing through the game to gain movement abilities such as the high jump and the reflector ray. Controlling Miriam as she accumulates upgrades should feel natural to any Metroidvania buff. My main criticism for Ritual of the Night is that it gets bogged down by its story presentation and quest system, specifically in the beginning of the game. It took me around 50 minutes just to enter the castle with Miriam due to story bits and dialogue and tackling some available quests. The other characters took me at most 20 minutes for reference, so I think there's definitely some fat there that could be trimmed, particularly the dialogue, which tends to come across as very ho-hum. It's a 2.5D game, which I've never been a huge fan of, but the game does a pretty good job of not drawing attention to the fact that there's a whole other dimension you could be exploring. It does lead to some janky exploration on the two towers though. Playing through as Miriam didn't quite win me over, but the bonus playable characters brought more and more to like about the game. In a break from Symphony of the Night, all of Bloodstained's BPCs have a menu screen so you can see their controls. Additionally, they all gain experience and level up, and can collect HP max ups and MP max ups to increase HP and MP. Zangetsu mode is available after getting the good ending as of the update pushed out May 2020. Unlike Miriam, he doesn't find items or equipment. Actually, he's a lot like Richter and Maria in that he has all of his abilities from the start and can play through the castle in any order. Zangetsu runs by default and is generally quite fast. He also has access to the backstep, double jump, and slide abilities. His default attack is to slash with his sword Zangetsu, which is all some people might need. He can also unleash a slower fierce slash, doling out higher damage. Similarly, with the flying Vajra, he leaps into the Helm Splitter attack. The Wild God's Blade technique is the non-leaping variant. Empty Blade is Zangetsu's method of high jump, swinging his sword upwards. For him it's more of an attack, but can be chained together to gain height. He can throw multiple knives, and moving the right stick will send out his kunai with chain to restrain an enemy or pull Zangetsu to a wall or ceiling. His Form as Emptiness attack can be useful for maneuvering around enemies in a pinch. And he can cycle his Zangetsu through the fire, ice, thunder, and non-elements with his Annihilated Mind technique. In addition to gaining the elemental attributes, his Fierce Slash, Throwing Knives, and Flying Vajra gain an extra effect. Fire creates an AoE explosion on contact. Ice raises damaging pillars from the ground, and Thunder creates an AoE lightning strike on contact. His last ability might be a little difficult to master, but is quite useful. By pressing forward attack, Zangetsu activates Eternity, raising his sword to guard against attacks, and you can hold the button as long as you want to hold the stance. When an enemy or attack hits his blade, not only is it blocked, but the enemy will be momentarily stunned, allowing Zangetsu to counterattack or reposition and get in a few hits, so I'd recommend taking a few minutes to get a handle on this move. Sometimes he can walk straight through the stunned enemy and turn around and start wailing on their back. Zangetsu can also taunt into Eternity, but it's more to play around with for fun as there's a large delay to the block. Overall, Zangetsu's aggressive, fast-paced playstyle is a fun time to be had, but there will be times where you'll feel his inability to heal while exploring, though he feels less like a glass cannon than Richter did, especially if you overlevel him. I'd recommend this mode to Castlevania bonus playable character veterans for sure, and even casual players will probably enjoy it. With the November 2020 update, Bloodless mode was added to the game. Accessed by entering Bloodless into the name entry, you begin what is probably the most varied of the BPCs. Unlike the other characters, Bloodless starts in her boss room, meaning she has the option of right or left off the bat. Checking the menu, you'll notice that her only listed ability is her default attack, swinging her red umbrella. She can also backstep, and her jump is higher than any of the other characters, though she never gets a double jump. And she can float with her umbrella by holding the jump button, but that's it. Another thing you'll notice nearby is this metal stand holding a blood shard. Breaking it grants Bloodless the slide, and this is the gist of her mode. Work your way through the castle, find the blood shard stands, and break them to unlock abilities. Oh, and the gold stands give out individual stat boosts. Here are the abilities she unlocks, loosely in the order you can acquire them. The specific locations for each are listed in my BPC guide. Scarlet Thrust shoots a thin stream of blood out and up, and can be upgraded with an additional blood shard in the 8-bit Nightmare. Next is her Charge Umbrella, which is a more powerful attack with a greater range. It doubles as Bloodless's block, and is a great way to get out of hairy situations, as long as she has enough time to charge up. Her Umbrella Toss harkens back to Castlevania's sub-weapons. The Umbrella Guillotine adds damage to her Umbrella Float. It has a pretty good damage output and can be improved with the Umbrella Float upgrade. Bloodsteel, her bread and butter, absorbs any blood splatter on screen, including that from Bloodless's attacks, but it only restores MP until she finds a vampiric blood shard later on, after which it restores HP as well. Scarlet Cyclone shoots a thick stream of blood and can be aimed with the right stick. Finding the Blood of Flight shard gives her her high jump ability. Once a blood pillar is launched, it will move back and forth and can be doubled by finding its second blood shard. And finally, Blood Rain rains blood down to damage her foes. Bloodless is probably the most difficult of Bloodstained's bonus playable characters to use. Starting off with almost no abilities alongside her frail defenses mean you die a lot, and sometimes you head in a direction hoping to find a helpful ability and find none. It's certainly a unique mode, but not for the faint of heart. The March 2022 update introduced Aurora mode. Aurora is the main character of the game Child of Light, which I haven't played and know next to nothing about, including why it was chosen to cross over with Bloodstained. But apparently this fulfills one of the Kickstarter's stretch goals. I applaud their efforts as Aurora brings another unique playstyle to the table. She begins in the Minerva Galleon, and like Bloodless is progression based, so she doesn't have all of her abilities to start. In addition to backstepping and sliding, Aurora's default attack is a two-handed slash with the Sword of Mathildas, which later becomes a one-handed slash after an upgrade. The Helm Splitter is a leaping attack dealing higher damage. And like Zangetsu, forward attack activates her parry to block attacks, immediately followed by a strong and wide-reaching counterattack, which is extremely effective against enemies in a line. But she can't hold the parry long, so her timing is more precise than Zangetsu's. By holding the right trigger, she can lock on, initially up to 3 times, with her Light Ray ability, causing heavy damage. She also has her companion familiar Igniculus, who will periodically attack enemies, occasionally inflicting slow status upon them. He'll also heal Aurora a bit if her health is low. So while she doesn't have access to all of her abilities from the start, what she does have is nothing to sneeze at. As Aurora defeats certain enemies, she will rescue some of her party companions in the form of Conjure and Familiar shards, which can be swapped out in the menu. These shards can increase their grade when Aurora collects the requisite Demon shard, and can increase their rank alongside her Light Ray skill by bringing collected materials to Johannes. But most importantly, Aurora herself upgrades at 3 different points in the castle. She gains the ability to fly by pressing jump twice after defeating Craftwork, which is where her gameplay shines. She can maneuver like Alucard's bat form, but is much faster and able to attack at will, just not parry. She upgrades again after defeating Valak, growing into an adult, changing her default attack to a one-headed slash, and enabling her to move freely underwater and explore more of the castle. And defeating Orbis turns her dress white, making her immune to spikes and other hazards, allowing her to access the Oriental Sorcery Lab, and later making the Harrier race a relative cakewalk. Aurora is an incredibly strong character, with her Light Ray, parry, and most of all, spamming gen abilities. Plus, flying sometimes puts her completely out of reach of some of the enemies. If you're into power fantasy experiences, this is the BPC for you. Saturn Maria is probably more powerful, but the two playstyles differ greatly, and both are worth a look. But as you're again exploring the same castle, if you've already done the previous 3 game modes, I'd recommend waiting a while before you jump into this one. Let's finish off Bloodstained with another speed comparison. I left out sliding and backdashing this time because both skills have a hefty cooldown in this game. Here are all the characters ranked from slowest to fastest. First is Aurora's default walking speed, followed by Miriam's default walking speed. Next is Bloodless's default walking speed, and then we have Aurora's flight, followed by Zangetsu's default walking speed, and finally Miriam's accelerator shard far outpacing the others. So that's all the BPCs from Symphony of the Night and Bloodstained. I know I didn't cover Alucard's luck mode, but that's just him with a max luck stat and all other stats lowered. Not really a bonus playable character. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of the Igavanias. I hope consolidating this information into one place is helpful. Eventually, in part 2 I'll be covering the Game Boy Advance trilogy, so keep an eye out for that. There's also the possibility of a BPC episode on a different game or series entirely. Any other bonus playable characters you know about that are worth checking out? For instance, I'm very familiar with Luigi in Super Mario Galaxy, and a lot of folks mentioned other Castlevania games like Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. These modes can bring a fresh experience to a well-worn game, so if you haven't already, I'd say pick one and give it a try. Thanks again for checking this out, and I hope to catch you in the next one.